Welcome to the Enchanted Library, where we turn the pages of books, beautiful and old, living and magical. It's time to curl up, get cozy, and join us on an adventure. Today we're reading from Beautiful Joe by Margaret Marshall Saunders. Chapter 30, Performing Animals. A week or two after we got home, I heard the Morris boys talking about an Italian who was coming to Fairport with a troop of trained animals, and I could see for myself, whenever I went to town, great flaming pictures on the fences of monkeys sitting at tables, dogs and ponies and goats climbing ladders and rolling balls while doing various tricks. I wondered very much whether they would be able to do all these extraordinary things, but it turned out that they could. The Italian's name was Bellini, and one afternoon the whole Morris family went to see him and his animals, and when they came home, I heard them talking about it. "I wish you could have been there, Joe," said Jack, pulling up my paws to rest on his knees. "Now listen, old fellow, and I'll tell you about it. First of all, there was a perfect jam in the town hall. I sat up in front with a lot of the fellows and had a splendid view. The old Italian came out dressed in his best suit of clothes, black broadcloth, flower in his buttonhole, and so on. He made a fine bow and said he was pleased to see ze fine audience, and he was going to show them ze fine animals, ze finest animals in ze world. Then he held up a little whistle and said he was different from other trainers who used a whip to control their animals. He only had to blow his whistle to show his animals when to begin, end, or change their tricks. Some boy yelled, 'Rats, you do whip them sometimes.' And the man made another bow and said, 'Sartainly he whipped them just as he mammas whipped ye naughty boys to make them still when they noisy or stubborn.' Then everyone laughed at the boy, and the Italian said the performance would begin by a grand procession of the animals, if some lady would kindly step up to the piano and play a march. Nina Smith, you know Nina, Joe, the girl who has black eyes and wears blue ribbons and lives around the corner, stepped up to the piano and banged out a fine, loud march. The doors at the side of the platform opened, and out came the animals, 2 by 2, just like Noah's Ark. There was a pony with a monkey walking beside it and holding on to its mane, another monkey on a pony's back, 2 monkeys hand in hand, a dog with a parrot on his back, a goat harnessed to a little carriage, another goat carrying a bird cage in its mouth with 2 canaries inside, different kinds of cats, some doves and pigeons, half a dozen white rats with red harnesses, and dragging a little chariot with a monkey in it, and a common white gander that came in last of all, and did nothing but follow one of the ponies about. The Italian spoke of the gander, and said it was a stupid creature and could learn no tricks, and he kept it only on account of its affection for the pony. He had got them both on a Vermont farm when he was looking for show animals. The pony's master had made a pet of him, and had taught him to come whenever he whistled. Though the pony was only a scrub of a creature, he had a gentle disposition, and every other animal on the farm liked him. This particular gander had such an admiration for him that he followed him wherever he went, and if he lost him for an instant, he would mount one of the knolls on the farm and stretch out his neck looking for him. When he caught sight of him, he gabbled with delight, and running up to him, waddled up and down beside him. Every little while the pony put his nose down and seemed to be having a conversation with the gander. If the farmer whistled for the pony, and he started to run to him, the gander, knowing he could not keep up, would seize the pony's tail in his beak, and, flapping his wings, would get along as fast as the pony did, and the pony never kicked him. The Italian saw that this pony would be a good one to train for the stage, so he offered the farmer a large price for him and took him away. Oh, Joe, I all forgot to say that by this time all the animals had been sent off the stage except the pony and the gander, and they stood looking at the Italian while he talked. I never saw anything so human in dumb animals as that pony face. He looked as if he understood every word his master was saying. After the story was over, the Italian told the pony to bow. He nodded his head at all the people, and they all laughed. Then the Italian asked him to favor us with a waltz, and the pony got up on his hind legs and danced. You should have seen that gander skirmishing around so as to be near the pony and yet keep out of the way of his heels. We fellows just roared, and we would have kept him dancing all the afternoon if the Italian hadn't begged the young gentleman not to make the noise, but let the pony do the rest of his tricks. Pony number 2 came on the stage, and it was too queer for anything to see the things the two of them did. They helped the Italian on with his coat. They pulled off his rubbers. They took his coat away and brought him a chair and dragged a table up to it. They brought him letters and papers and rang bells and rolled barrels and swung the Italian in a big swing and jumped a rope and walked up and down steps. They just went around that stage as handy with their teeth as 2 boys would be with their hands, and they seemed to understand every word their master said to them. The best trick of all was telling the time and doing questions in arithmetic. The Italian pulled his watch out of his pocket and showed it to the first pony, whose name was Diamond, and said, "What time is it?" The pony looked at it and then scratched 4 times with his forefoot on the platform. The Italian said, "That's good, 4 o'clock. But it's a few minutes after 4. How many?" The pony scratched again 5 times. The Italian showed his watch to the audience and said it was just 5 minutes past 4. Then he asked the pony how old he was. He scratched 4 times. That meant 4 years. He asked him how many days in a week there were, how many months in a year, and he gave him some questions in addition and subtraction, and the pony answered them all correctly. Of course, the Italian was giving him some sign, but though we watched him closely, we couldn't make out what it was. At last, he told the pony he had been very good and done his lessons well. If it would rest him, he might be naughty a little while. All of a sudden, a wicked look came into the creature's eyes. He turned around and kicked up his heels at his master. He pushed over the table and chairs and knocked down a blackboard where he had been rubbing out figures with a sponge held in his mouth. The Italian pretended to be cross and said, "Come, come, this won't do," and he called the other pony to him and told him to take the troublesome fellow off the stage. The second one nosed Diamond and pushed him about, finally bit him by the ear and led him away squealing. The gander followed, gabbling as fast as he could, and there was a regular roar of applause. After that, there were ladders brought in, Joe, and dogs came on. Not well-bred, but curs, something like you. The Italian said he can't teach tricks to pedigree animals as well as to scrubs. These dogs jumped the ladders and climbed them, went through them, and did all kinds of things. The man blew his whistle once, and they began. Twice they did backwards what they had done forwards. 3 times, and they stopped. And every animal, dogs, goats, ponies, and monkeys, after they had finished their tricks, ran up to their master, and he gave them a lump of sugar. They seemed fond of him, and often when they weren't performing, went up to him and licked his hands or his sleeve. There was one boss dog, Joe, with a head like yours. Bob, they called him, and he did all his tricks alone. The Italian went off the stage, and the dog came on and made his bow, and climbed his ladders and jumped his hurdles and went off again. The audience howled for an encore, and didn't he come out alone, make another bow, and retire? I saw old Judge Brown wiping the tears from his eyes, he'd laughed so much. One of the last tricks was the goat, and the Italian said it was the best of all, because the goat is such a hard animal to teach. He had a big ball, and the goat got on it and rolled across the stage without getting off. He looked as nervous as a cat, shaking his head and trying to keep his 4 hooves close enough to keep him on the ball. We had a funny little play at the end of the performance. A monkey dressed as a lady, in a white satin frock and a bonnet with a white veil, came on the stage. She was Miss Green, and the dog Bob was going to elope with her. He was all rigged out as Mr. Smith, and had on a light suit of clothes, and a tall hat on the side of his head, high collar, long cuffs, and he carried a cane. He was a regular dude. He stepped up to Miss Green on his hind legs, and helped her on to a pony's back. The pony galloped off the stage, and then a crowd of monkeys, chattering and wringing their hands, came on. Mr. Smith had run away with their child. They were all dressed up, too. There were the father and mother, with gray wigs and black clothes, and the young Greens in bibs and tuckers. They were a queer-looking crowd. While they were going on in this way, the pony trotted back on the stage, and they all flew at him, and pulled Miss Green from his back, and laughed and chattered and boxed her ears, and took off her white veil and her satin dress, and put on an old brown thing, and some of them seized the dog, and kicked his hat, and broke his cane, and stripped the clothes off, and threw them in the corner, and bound his legs with cords. A goat came on, harnessed to a little cart. They threw the dog in it, and wheeled him around the stage a few times. Then they took him out, tied him to a hook in the wall, and the goat ran off the stage, and the monkeys ran to one side, and one of them pulled out a little revolver, pointed it at the dog, pretended to fire, and he dropped down as if he were dead. The monkeys stood looking at him, and there was such the most awful hullabaloo you ever heard. Such a barking and yelping, and half a dozen dogs rushed onto the stage. And didn't they trundle those monkeys about? They nosed them and pushed them and shook them, till they all ran away, all but Miss Green, who sat shivering in a corner. After a while she crept up to the dead dog, pawed him a little, and didn't he jump up as much alive as any of them? Everybody in the room clapped and shouted, and then the curtain dropped, and the thing was over. I wish he'd give another performance. Early in the morning he has to go to Boston. Jack pushed my paws from his knees and went outdoors, and I began to think I should very much like to see those performing animals. It was not yet tea time, and I should have plenty of time to take a run down to the hotel where they were staying, so I set out. It was a lovely autumn evening. The sun was going down in a haze, and it was quite warm. Earlier in the day I heard Mr. Morris say that this was our Indian summer, and that we should soon have cold weather. Fairport was a pretty little town, and from the principal street one could look out upon the blue water of the bay and see the island opposite, which was quite deserted now, for all the summer visitors had gone home, and the island house was shut up. I was running down one of the steep side streets that led to the water when I met a heavily laden cart coming up. It must have been coming from one of the vessels, for it was full of strange-looking boxes and packages. A fine-looking nervous horse was drawing it, and he was straining every nerve to get it up the steep hill. His driver was a burly, hard-faced man, and instead of letting his horse stop a minute to rest, he was urging him forward. The poor horse kept looking at his master, his eyes almost starting from his head in terror. He knew the whip was about to descend on his quivering body, and so it did, and there was no one to interfere. No one but a woman in a ragged shawl, who would have no influence with the driver. There was a very good humane society in Fairport, and none of the teamsters dared ill-use their horses if any of the members were near. This was a quiet, out-of-the-way street, with only poor houses on it, and the man probably knew that none of the members of the society would be likely to living in them. He whipped his horse and whipped him, till every lash made my heart ache, and if I had dared, I would have bitten him severely. Suddenly there was a dull thud in the street. The horse's head had given out, and he had fallen down. The driver ran to his head, but he was quite dead. "Thank God," said the poorly dressed woman bitterly. "One more out of this world of misery." Then she turned and went down the street. I was glad for the horse. He would never be frightened or miserable again, and I went slowly on, thinking that death would be the best thing that could happen to tortured animals. The Fairport Hotel was built right in the center of town, and the shops and houses crowded quite close about it. It was a high brick building and called the Fairport House. As I was running along the sidewalk, I heard someone speak to me, and looking up I saw Charlie Montague. I had heard the Morrises say that his parents were staying at the hotel for a few weeks, while their house was being repaired. He had his Irish setter Brisk with him, and a handsome dog he was, as he stood waving his silky tail in the sunlight. Charlie patted me, and then he and his dog went into the hotel. I turned into the stable yard. It was a small, choked-up place, and as I picked my way under the cabs and wagons, I wondered why the hotel people didn't buy some of the old houses nearby and tear them down and make a stable yard worthy of such a nice hotel. The hotel horses were just getting rubbed down after their day's work, and others were coming in. The men were talking and laughing, and there was no sign of strange animals, so I went around to the back of the yard. Here they were, in an empty cow stable under a hayloft. There were 2 little ponies tied up in a stall, 2 goats beyond them, and dogs and monkeys in strong traveling cages. I stood in the doorway and stared at them. I was sorry for the dogs to be shut up on such a lovely evening, but I suppose their master was afraid of their getting lost or being stolen if he let them loose. They all seemed very friendly. The ponies turned around and looked at me with their gentle eyes, and then went on munching their hay. I wondered very much where the gander was, and went a little further into the stable. Something white raised itself up out of the brownest pony's crib, and there was the gander close up beside the open mouth of his friend. The monkeys made a jabbering noise and held onto the bars of their cage with their little black hands while they looked out at me. The dogs sniffed the air and wagged their tails and tried to put their muzzles through the bars of their cages. I liked the dogs best, and I wanted to see the one they called Bob, so I went quite close to them. There were 2 little white dogs, something like Billy, 2 mongrel spaniels, an Irish terrier, and a brown dog asleep in the corner. I knew it must be Bob. He did look a little like me, but he was not quite so ugly, for he had his ears and tail. While I was peering through the bars at him, a man came into the stable. He noticed me the first thing, but instead of driving me out, he spoke kindly to me, in a language I did not understand, so I knew he was the Italian. How glad the animals were to see him. The gander fluttered out of his nest, the ponies pulled at their halters, the dogs whined and tried to reach his hands to lick them, and the monkeys chattered with delight. He laughed and talked back to them in queer, soft-sounding words. Then he took out of a bag on his arm bones for the dogs, nuts and cakes for the monkeys, nice juicy carrots for the ponies, some green stuff for the goats, and corn for the gander. It was a pretty sight to see the old man feeding his pets, and it made me feel quite hungry, so I trotted home. I had a run downtown again that evening with Mr. Morris, who wanted to get something from a shop for his wife. He never let his boys go to town after dark, so if there were errands to be done, he or Mrs. Morris went. The town was bright and lively that evening, and a great many people were walking about and looking into the shop windows. When we came home, I went into the kennel with Jim, and there I slept till the middle of the night. Then I started up and ran outside. There was a distant bell ringing, which we often heard in Fairport, and which always meant fire. Chapter 31. A Fire in Fairport. I had several times run to a fire with the boys, and knew that there was always a great noise and excitement. There was a light in the house, so I knew somebody was getting up. I don't think, indeed I know, for they were good boys, that they ever wanted to see anybody lose their property, but they did enjoy seeing a blaze, and one of their greatest delights, when there hadn't been a fire for some time, was to build a bonfire in the garden. Jim and I ran around to the front of the house and waited. In a few minutes, someone came rattling at the front door, and I felt sure it was Jack. However, it was Mr. Morris, and without a word to us, he set off running toward the town. As we hurried after him, other men ran out from their houses along the streets and either joined him or dashed ahead. They seemed to have dressed in a hurry, and were thrusting their arms in their coats and buttoning them up as they went. Some of them had hats, and some of them had none, and they all had their faces toward the great red light ahead of us that kept getting brighter and brighter. "Where's the fire?" they shouted to each other. "Don't know. Afraid it's the hotel or the town hall? I hope not. What a blaze. How's the water supply now? Bad time for a fire." It was the hotel. We saw that as soon as we got onto the main street. There were people all about, and a great noise and confusion and smoke and blackness, and up above, bright tongues of flame were leaping against the sky. Jim and I kept close to Mr. Morris's heels as he pushed his way through the crowd. When we got nearer the burning building, we saw men carrying ladders and axes. Others were shouting directions and rushing out of the hotel, carrying boxes and bundles and furniture in their arms. From the windows above came a steady stream of articles thrown among the crowd. A mirror struck Mr. Morris on the arm, and a whole package of clothes fell on his head and almost smothered him, but he brushed them aside and scarcely noticed them. There was something the matter with Mr. Morris. I knew by the worry sound of his voice when he spoke to anyone. I could not see his face, though it was light as day above us, for we had got jammed in the crowd, and if I had not kept between his feet, I should have been trodden to death. Jim had gotten separated from us. Presently, Mr. Morris raised his voice above the uproar and called, "Is everyone out of the hotel?" A voice shouted back, "I'm going up to see." "It's Jim Watson, the fireman," cried someone near. "He's risking his life to go into that pit of flame. Don't go, Watson." I don't think the brave fireman paid any attention to this warning, for an instant later the same voice said, "He's planting his ladder against the 3rd story. He's bound to go. He'll not get any farther than the 2nd anyway." "Where are the Montagues?" shouted Mr. Morris. "Has anyone seen the Montagues?" "Mr. Morris! Mr. Morris!" cried a frightened voice, and young Charles Montague pressed through the people to us. "Where's Papa?" "I don't know. Where did you leave him?" said Mr. Morris, taking his hand and drawing him close to him. "I was sleeping in his room," said the boy, "and a man knocked at the door and said, 'Hotel on fire. 5 minutes to dress and get out.' And Papa told me to put on my clothes and go downstairs, and he ran up to Mama." "Where was she?" asked Mr. Morris quickly. "On the 4th floor. She and her maid Blanche were up there. You know Mama hasn't been well and couldn't sleep, and our room was so noisy that she moved upstairs where it was quiet." Mr. Morris gave a kind of groan. "Oh, I'm so hot, and there's such a dreadful noise," said the little boy, bursting into tears. "And I want Mama." Mr. Morris soothed him as best he could and drew him a little to the edge of the crowd. While he was doing this, there was a piercing cry. I could not see the person making it, but I knew it was the Italian's voice. He was screaming in broken English that the fire was spreading to the stables, and his animals would be burned. Would no one help him get them out? There was a great deal of confused language. Some voices shouted, "Look after the people first, let the animals go." Others said, "For shame, get the horses out." But no one seemed to do anything, for the Italian went on crying for help. I heard a number of people who were standing near us saying that it had just been found out that several persons who had been sleeping in the top of the hotel had not got out. They said at one of the attic windows a poor housemaid was shrieking for help. Here in the street we could see no one at the upper windows, for the smoke was pouring from them. The air was very hot and heavy, and I didn't wonder that Charlie Montague felt ill. He would have fallen on the ground if Mr. Morris hadn't taken him in his arms and carried him out of the crowd. He put him down on the brick sidewalk and unfastened his little shirt, and left me to watch him, while he held his hands under a leak in a hose that was fastened to a hydrant near us. He got enough water to dash on Charlie's face and chest, and then, seeing that the boy was reviving, he sat down on the curbstone and took him on his knee. Charlie lay in his arms and moaned. He was a delicate boy, and he could not stand rough usage as the Morris boys could. Mr. Morris was terribly uneasy. His face was deathly white, and he shuddered whenever there was a cry from the burning buildings. "Poor souls, God help them. Oh, this is awful," he said. And then he turned his eyes from the great sheets of flame and strained the little boy to his breast. At last there were wild shrieks that I knew came from no human throats. The fire must have reached the horses. Mr. Morris sprang up, and then sank back again. He wanted to go, yet he could be of no use. There were hundreds of men standing about, but the fire had spread so rapidly, and they had so little water to put on it, that there was not much they could do. I wondered whether there was anything I could do for the poor animals. I was not so much afraid of fire as most dogs, for one of the tricks the Morris boys had taught me was to put out a blaze with my paws. They would throw a piece of lighted paper on the floor, and I would crush it with my forepaws, and if the blaze was too large for that, I would drag an old bit of carpet over it and jump on it. I left Mr. Morris and ran around the corner of the street to the back of the hotel. It was not burned as much here as in the front, and people were spreading wet blankets on the roofs of the nearby houses. Some were standing at the windows watching the fire, or packing their belongings as if ready to move if it should spread to them. There was a narrow lane running up behind the hotel, and I had just started up this lane when in front of me I heard such a wailing, piercing noise that I shuddered and stood still. The Italian's animals were going to be burned up, and they were calling to their master to come and let them out. Their voices sounded like the voices of children in mortal pain. I could not stand it. I was suddenly seized with such an awful horror of fire that I turned and ran, feeling so thankful I was not in it. As I got into the street, I stumbled over something. It was a large bird, a parrot, and at first I thought it was Bella. Then I remembered hearing that Jack say the Italian had a parrot. It was not dead, but seemed stupid with the smoke. I seized it with my mouth and ran and laid it at Mr. Morris's feet. He wrapped it in his handkerchief and laid it beside him. I sat and trembled and did not leave him again. I shall never forget that dreadful night. It seemed as if we were there for hours, but in reality it was only a short time. The hotel soon got to be all red flames, and there was very little smoke. The inside of the burning had burned away, and nothing more could be taken out. The firemen and all the people drew back, and there was no noise. Everybody stood gazing silently at the flames. A man stepped quietly up to Mr. Morris, and looking at him, I saw it was Mr. Montague. He was usually a well-dressed man with a kind face and a head of thick, grayish-brown hair. Now his face was black and grimy, his hair was burnt from the front of his head, and his clothes were half torn from his back. Mr. Morris sprang up when he saw him and said, "Where is your wife?" The gentleman did not say a word, but pointed to the burning building. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Morris. "Is there no mistake? Your beautiful young wife, Montague. Can it be so?" Mr. Morris was trembling from head to foot. "It is true," said Mr. Montague quietly. "Give me the boy." Charlie had fainted again, and his father took him in his arms and turned away. "Montague," cried Mr. Morris, "my heart is sore for you. Can I do nothing?" "No, thank you," said the gentleman without turning around. But there was more anguish in his voice than in Mr. Morris's, and though I am only a dog, I knew his heart was breaking. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and share our podcast with a friend. Visit our website at www.enchantedlibrary.net to see our past books or to connect with us on Facebook. If you'd like to support the work we do, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/enchantedlibrary. We appreciate your support. Until next time, friends, happy reading.